From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Thursday, March 6, 2025. Brisbane residents will bear the brunt of Cyclone Alfred's 155km/h winds, rain and flooding on Friday, when the storm is expected to lash the Queensland capital for 12 hours. For all the latest on the Category 2 storm, visit theaustralian.com.au. Defence Minister Richard Marles says he's absolutely confident US President Donald Trump will follow through on his support of the historic AUKUS defence pact between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom. But South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas says questions about the White House's commitment are starting to wear thin. In a wide-ranging conversation at the Defending Australia conference in Adelaide on Wednesday, co-hosted by The Australian and our colleagues at The Advertiser, the Defence Minister fielded questions about AUKUS, defence spending and those warships off the Australian coast. In today's episode, we're bringing you parts of that fascinating conversation with Richard Marles and Shadow Minister for Defence Andrew Hastie.
Minister, I was going to ask, do you trust Donald Trump when it comes to his support for AUKUS?
That's The Australian's chief international correspondent Cameron Stewart, chatting with Defence Minister Richard Marles in Adelaide on Wednesday.
I do, and I actually have a sense of confidence about where we can take the alliance under the Trump administration and the alignment of effort in terms of the focus that we're bringing to bear in terms of our own security, but what the United States is doing in terms of its focus on the Indo-Pacific.
South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas, who'd broken ground on a new shipbuilding academy that'll produce the graduates who'll build AUKUS submarines earlier on Wednesday alongside the Defence Minister, jumped in.
Can I ask a question? I was thinking about this today after our press conference. Every single time Richard or I have stood up announcing some progress milestone in terms of AUKUS, or any other time on radio in South Australia an event has occurred where AUKUS becomes a topic of conversation, I get asked that question. I'm not too sure what more needs to be done before those questions stop. All three countries have gone through a change in administration or government from one political party to the other, and not one word has been uttered by any Prime Minister, any Defence Minister or Defence Secretary or the US President of either political persuasion that has actually said anything on the record that would suggest that AUKUS isn't an ongoing commitment. And yet, while I can understand there's a desire to ask the question given that things can change quickly, evidently, nonetheless, there's been no suggestion that this is going to be an issue.
Sure, but Premier Colby today spoke about the fact that he thought it was great to sell Virginia-class submarines to Australia, but he said if the production of those submarines is not fast enough, that might be a problem for the US. That comes to a central question as to trust in future administrations to actually sell those submarines if the Virginia rollout is not fast enough.
Yeah, I can understand those comments, but in a sense, let's think that through. It is really, I think, the beauty of the optimal pathway that we announced in March of 23, that there really is something in it for all three countries. We are playing a very significant role now in increasing the production rate and the sustainment rate of Virginia-class submarines in America for America. That's something that they acknowledge. That is something which is utterly different to any other relationship they have with literally any other country when it comes to their bilateral defence relationships. The strategic benefit to the United States of AUKUS is really understood by the United States. And if the production rates don't increase in relation to Virginia's, as both Pete and I were saying to each other, there's a whole lot of issues that America faces in that moment. But what AUKUS is about is ensuring that we jointly succeed on that effort. It is in Australia's interest that America has a greater availability of Virginia-class submarines. We need America to be the most capable they can be, and America needs us to be the most capable we can be. And they're fundamentally, I think you used the word trust. Trust is actually at the heart of the relationship. And to Pete's point, I mean, we do keep getting asked those questions. I get that we will get those questions. It is a lot of money. It goes over a long period of time. But what I'm really confident about is we'll answer those questions. That means something. What means much more is the actions that we put into place, and that is what's occurring.
In the hours before his Defence Minister sat down to chat with Cam Stewart, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was moving to reassure Australians the Royal Australian Navy was keeping close tabs on a flotilla of Chinese warships currently off the coast of WA.
The Chinese vessels are currently, as of a very short while ago, 593 kilometres southwest of Adelaide.
The trio of ships entered international waters between Australia and New Zealand on Friday, where they conducted a series of live fire exercises that sent air traffic control into disarray.
It, of course, last Friday caused chaos in the air between New Zealand and Australia, forcing the diversion of 49 flights when it began a live fire exercise.
The Chinese vessels have been circumnavigating Australia in the days since, shadowed by Australian Navy ships.
In seas never previously sailed by the Chinese Navy. The warships are being shadowed by HMAS Stuart and New Zealand frigate Takaha. The federal government believes China not only wants to show its military reach, but normalise its presence in the region.
The appearance of the ships called the readiness of Australia's Defence Force into question and prompted a diplomatic war of words, with leaders from Australia and New Zealand claiming China should have given both nations a heads up before commencing the exercise. In Adelaide on Wednesday, it was the question on everybody's lips.
How often have we seen that before?
We've seen Chinese warships in the vicinity of Australia before. I would describe it as an unusual event. It's not a completely unprecedented event, though. When it became clear that a task group was coming to Australia, we, in an unprecedented way, made a decision, and it was very much a direction of mine, to make sure that we were surveilling this to the greatest possible extent. We did that, and I did that because it appeared to me at the outset that there was the prospect of this task group being in the vicinity of Australia for some time. We needed to do two things, which is what we have done. The first was to ensure that the task group complied with international law at all times, and I'm advised that they have, and that is important to understand. And secondly, to get a clear understanding of what the task group is trying to achieve in its mission by looking at exactly where it goes, its configurations, the training and the activities that it's undertaken. And we've had a close eye on all of that, which of course is our right. I'd make this point as well, though. International law has to be our touchstone here. It has to be our touchstone because there is much more often Australian Navy ships in the vicinity of China than there are Chinese Navy ships in the vicinity of Australia.
Do we do live firing exercises there?
We do live firing exercises on the high seas, which is what China did, but we also were not happy about the notice that was given by the Chinese Navy in that particular event, and we made our concerns known to China, both in Canberra and Beijing, and at the level of our foreign ministers. But I come back to the point. We are much more present in the vicinity of China than China is in the vicinity of Australia. And that's not gratuitous, that's for a reason, because that's where our trading routes are. And it's really important that we are in a position to continue to assert freedom of navigation in and around our trading routes. For that to occur, to continue, international law has to be our touchstone and our bedrock. We're taking this very seriously. We've surveilled this in a way that was not done previously under the former government. But equally, we're not breathlessly trying to ham this up either. And it's really important that we observe the fact that they have been maintaining their obligations in respect of international law, and that's relevant in the context of what we seek to do in the proximity of China.
And that's fair enough, sure. But you've seen what they were doing, and I think you said a couple of days ago you're trying to find out a bit more about exactly what they were doing. But is it cricket? Are they trying to send a message? Or is this just bog standard Navy drills?
Look, I'm not saying that. I think it is really important to conduct this surveillance to properly understand exactly what they were doing, what they were practicing, and I think from there to understand what message, if any, is being sent to us. And I'm not going to leap into that and speculate about that before we get the proper assessments coming through in respect of what we have observed. I'm not for a moment, and I don't want to be seen as suggesting that this is standard. That is not my position. It is the case that they've complied with international law. We're not going to fall into the trap of breathlessly complaining about activities which are in compliance with international law, which would lead us to being in a compromised position in terms of what we seek to do within the vicinity of China. That said, we are clearly going to observe this really carefully, which we have been doing, to understand exactly what's going on and to understand exactly what was being practiced and what messages are being sent. And I'm not at all sanguine about all of that.
In a surprise statement on Tuesday, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said he's open to sending Australian troops to Ukraine in a peacekeeping capacity. It followed a fiery White House exchange between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and US Vice President JD Vance that flipped everyone's understanding of the Russia-Ukraine war on its head.
What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are...
In Adelaide on Wednesday, Defence Minister Richard Marles said comparing Australia's reluctance to send boats to the Red Sea during a period of heightened attacks on commercial shipping vessels in late 2023 isn't exactly comparing apples with apples.
I think we need to be clear about exactly what America asked. We are focused, and it is part of what comes out of the Defence Strategic Review and is now in the National Defence Strategy. We are very much focused on the Indo-Pacific. We are focused on our strategic task, and that is to build a defence force which can resist coercion from any potential adversary. Now, we see that what is happening in Ukraine is relevant to that. It's relevant to that because the global rules-based order that is so central to our national interest as an island trading nation, where there's a physical manifestation, and that's our sea lines of communication, freedom of navigation goes directly to our national prosperity, where all of that is under pressure in our region and all of that is on trial in Ukraine. Now, we have been supporting Ukraine from the get-go and we will continue to support Ukraine. Right now, there are Australian personnel in Britain who are involved in the training of new recruits to the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So we actually have Australian servicemen and women committed right now. The only point we've made is that as we listen to our partners, which over the last 3 years has been the United States, but our partners in Europe, including the United Kingdom, including Ukraine itself, when they have asked for support, we have considered that and worked out how we can do it. And if there is a request of this kind, we'll do the same. We'll consider it and work out if we can make a contribution.
And on that line, if the US military aid to Ukraine continues to be frozen, would that be a reason for Australia to consider an increase of military aid to Ukraine?
I think the fundamental answer here is we will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes for Ukraine to resolve this conflict on its terms. And again, it's an understandable question that's been consistently asked of me during the last 3 years, and we have consistently been announcing packages of support for Ukraine. We'll continue to go down this path, and as requests are made of us by Ukraine itself or by our partners who are supporting Ukraine, we'll consider them.
Coming up, Shadow Minister for Defence Andrew Hastie sits down with the Australian's Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent Ben Packham. On Wednesday, Donald Trump's pick for a top job at the US Department of Defence put the pressure on Australia to ratchet up defence spending. Elbridge Colby noted Australia is currently well below the 3% level of GDP advocated for by NATO, despite our relative proximity to China. Defence Minister Richard Marles said Labor is, if re-elected, willing to engage with the US on defence spending.
Firstly, we have increased defence spending, as you said, Cam, under our government. It's an additional $50 billion over the decade, which is now actually in the budget. And to contextualise, that's the biggest increase in defence spending in our peacetime history. So I understand very much the position that America is taking. I think it is completely reasonable that America is asking its friends and allies around the world to do more. We're totally willing to engage in that conversation with the United States, which we've already started.
Marles' opposition counterpart Andrew Hastie told Ben Packham the coalition will pony up if they're elected.
Look, we've already indicated very publicly that we will increase defence expenditure We gave a hint of that over the weekend with the additional $3 billion committed towards the acquisition of the 4th Squadron of F-35s, but we'll announce our full costings and our budgetary plan in due course closer to the election.
A whole 1%, that's quite a big leap. Where does the money come from, do you think, to get the defence budget up to that sort of a level?
That's a good question, and I'm sure the Deputy Prime Minister's working that through as well, because it's a message to Australia from Bridge Colby, who's going to take a very central part in the Trump administration. So we've got our plan. We're going to announce that in due course, and you won't be getting a scoop here, Ben, sorry to say.
The personnel crisis that Defence is facing, it's one of the biggest challenges facing the ADF, and it could seriously limit our capability ambitions. This isn't a new thing. It was a problem under the former government too. What would the Coalition do differently to get more Australians into uniform? Is it about offering more money, lowering standards? What's the plan?
I think there's a range of things. We are having a recruiting crisis, and last year 90% of ADF applicants withdrew their application from Defence. I think we need to challenge this generation of Australians to service, fairly old school values of serving your country, defending your country, being part of this great Anzac tradition which has been handed down to us. I think that's really important. And the point I'm making is that political leadership matters here, and if we're not getting a signal from the government that service in the ADF is important, it's a really great opportunity to grow as a person. And of course there are benefits as well, but when every ad is about self-actualisation rather than service, if it's not a challenge given to these young people, they're not going to take it up. I also think there's big problems within recruiting itself. Administrative bungles, people being basically eliminated because of previous medical records, which I think are quite trivial. So there's a risk aversion within the actual contractors who run recruiting. And I think we should have more uniforms against that problem, just like the Marine Corps do. They put their best officers and their best enlisted against the problem. They give them targets, and it's a part of progression for them in their careers.
You've been quite direct in your attacks on Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles, accusing them of weak leadership. You said it recently in relation to the Chinese warships. How do you think the government has been weak, and what would you do differently on defence?
I think the Prime Minister failed to stand up for the national interest, and he failed to insist on mutual respect. Now, the Deputy Prime Minister said that we often do patrols up in waters that are contested under international law as part of multilateral formations or groupings. And my understanding is whenever we've done live fire in that context, it's always been deconflicted, controlled, and as part of a wider coalition. For example, we're not off the coast of China disrupting their commercial flight path. And so the issue was that we didn't get notice, and it disrupted our commercial flight path. And I think the message is quite clear from the Chinese government. They're now a global power with a blue water navy. They're projecting deep into our waters. And this happened at the same time, of course, that Donald Trump was resetting relationships in Europe with NATO. And I think it was a test for us. There's a reason why they sailed past the Philippines, through the Arafura Sea, the Coral Sea, down past Sydney, and they've circumnavigated the country as well. So I think there's a message there. And I think the average person on the street with a PhD in life got the message pretty loud and clear.
Is it strange to you that Anthony Albanese would be open to sending troops to Ukraine but not Peter Dutton? Why shouldn't we back our support for Kyiv with boots on the ground?
Look, I think there's been no formal request, as I understand it, and this would be a decision for the Prime Minister and the National Security Committee of Cabinet. And so there's a lot to play out yet in the negotiations, which reached an inflection point on the weekend in the White House. And so I think this is a decision for a government of the day when a request comes forward. That's not ruling it in or ruling it out, but I just don't think we should rush. I just don't think we should rush to commit young Australians to a conflict without a request. And so I think Peter and I are very closely aligned on this.
On AUKUS, we've seen Donald Trump cozy up to Russia, call Vladimir Zelensky a dictator, and whack a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. Do you trust Donald Trump to do what he says? And in your view, is AUKUS a lock under his leadership?
Look, I think AUKUS is a lock under his leadership, but I think Donald Trump, as a president, studies your hand very closely. And I think it's incumbent upon the Prime Minister to demonstrate a strong hand in future negotiations. And I think the Prime Minister is flat-footed, he's not agile, and he should have gone already to meet with Donald Trump. and to establish that relationship. We've got a great hand. We've got strategic depth here, which is what we're going to deliver through AUKUS. We're already delivering it through Darwin and Alice Springs and the joint facilities that we have there. And of course, we have an abundance of rare earths and critical minerals, which will be essential for military and space applications going forward.
So we need to come bearing gifts, really?
Not come bearing gifts. Stake our position and argue it. Bit of hip and shoulder.
Okay. In the Oval Office.
I think in any sort of negotiation, you need strength.
Ben Packham is the Australian's Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent, and Cameron Stewart is our Chief International Correspondent. You can read all our team's reporting and analysis right now at theaustralian.com.au.